Okay, so what is Project Fold? Over the last few videos that I've made, where I've been doing my different style experiments inside of Blender, I've been referring to the fact that I'm working on an animated project that I'm kind of codenaming Project Fold. And I haven't really said much about what it is, but it's actually a really long time coming. It's not some random sudden decision to make like a short film, like I think everyone goes through at some point in learning Blender. About 8 years ago, I ran something that I've kind of mentioned slightly over time on this channel, but I haven't really gone into too much depth. I ran an alternate reality game called Entropy, and it is chronicled on the Game Detective's website. You can see that here. Now, if you don't know, an alternate reality game is, think about a story, like a fictional story that kind of occurs in real life or has a meta real life element where people solve puzzles to kind of progress the storyline. It doesn't always have to be so puzzle focused, but you might have encountered them without even realizing because a lot of companies use them for marketing purposes. Like for example, with Marathon that released recently, they had an alternate reality game where people could participate in the releasing of certain content in the game, like the Cryo Archive. There are very specific communities of people that are hyper focused in on discovering args, solving them, and collating all the information about them. So I designed and ran this ARG called Entropy. It gained quite a bit of attention, and people made sure to record whatever they could in their own wiki. The Game Detective is one of these ARG communities. They didn't manage to collect everything, and I've got hundreds of like loose pages of notes and designs, and I'm pretty sure I've lost a lot of data, like on old hard drives, and old email accounts related to the project might have been deleted by Google for an activity. I'm really not that sure. So there's probably a lot of information that's been lost. However, not only did people chronicle this story of mine on the wiki, a little while ago, a podcast called Argonauts did a nearly 3-hour episode on my project. If you want to listen to it, it's the Argonauts podcast, and the episode is just called Entropy. So what the hell was all this about? Well, basically, before I had any attention of any kind, I still had some Blender skills, and I was rattling around a lot of, passions and philosophies about the nature or the shape of reality and symmetry and identity, which is also incidentally the name of a piece of artwork of mine. And I wanted to bring everything together into a story where I could kind of express that in a way that would be interesting for people. It just so happens that even like 4 years to 6 years before 2018, I had already been kind of writing my own space opera type thing and designing my own language, a conlang. I remember working on that in school when I got bored in between lessons. So the seeds for this had been placed like a long time ago. I will tell you a bit about the story, but I want you to keep in mind that, some things have changed. As I have learned more in these last 8 years of doing YouTube, my approach to everything has changed slightly. You see, in the story, there's a very specific set of rules for how reality works, but the exact ways for how I want to approach explaining that to people and presenting that narratively and artistically, that's kind of shifted a bit in a way that I think has more depth. So if you do want to investigate the old stuff, and again, that nearly 3-hour podcast, which is kind of really funny listening to people talk about it, it's also something I haven't listened to the whole thing because I think I should keep some distance because it's really weird. This is one of the only projects I've done where I developed something that I put out to people and then it emotionally resonated with them to such a strong degree that I was getting like emails from people who were just kind of, like really trying to connect with the characters, like they were writing to the characters. And there's some really nice and meaningful stuff in there. I feel like with this kind of project, I should keep some distance and just focus on being the creator and then, let other people discuss it, record it, do whatever they want with it kind of on their own because it becomes an entirely new thing when people adopt it and make it meaningful in their lives. So I'll give you a little breakdown of the general story without spoiling much. But to do that, let's open PureRef. All right, so I'm in my PureRef where I've been putting my recent style experiments, of which you can access production files on curtisholt.online/members if you are a $5 tier patron and above. By the way, everyone who signed up recently to the Patreon, thank you so much because you are a driving force in why I'm now deciding to go ahead with this project. So as you now know, the ARG was called Entropy. Let me just bring in that little picture. What the hell is Entropy? And how does this connect to my new project, Fold? So in my universe, if you want to call it that, reality, so all of creation has a very specific shape to it. And when I say shape, I don't just mean kind of geometrically, I mean in its composition. And it's something that can't really be visualized or understood because it's a sort of hyperdimensional space. But pretty much everything around, like every story from every perspective, relies on interactions with this hyperdimensional space of some kind. A lot of the questions, a lot of the puzzles rely on how do we actually interpret this thing? Is it all random chance or is it designed? How does it interact with us? How can we interact with it? And really, in a lot of the stories, there's a lot of misinterpretation. It's a lot of people from different perspectives getting glimpses of this hyper reality and making incorrect assumptions, and then that leading them into strange situations. Because that's really just what science is. It's like, well, we get a glimpse of this weird pattern. We have a theory, and then in the end, it's like, oh, that's not really right. Now, the hyper reality in this story is freaking weird. Again, I don't really want to go into specifics because that will be the nature of puzzles. But in a way, the geometry of the hyperreality can change, and in doing so, really kind of effed up things can happen without completely breaking reality. I've made a lot of notes on thermodynamics and how you can insert energy into a system one way and lose it another way, but then depending on exactly how that happens, like what weird stuff is going to occur, and then how does the reality compensate so it doesn't completely lose continuity and stuff like that. Within the reality the closest example I can give are different universes. Now, I want to be a little bit careful when I say this because in my mind, I have a concept for what the geometry is. And again, not to give too much away, it would be less appropriate to think of them as like bubbles of universes and more appropriate to think about it as, if you have a wave, think about it as the negative space between a wave is where the universes are. Now, that's not completely accurate, but I just think it's a bit better to think about it that way rather than thinking of them as like kind of disparate bubbles, because in that way you can see how reality is intrinsically connected to other verses, which is why I tend to call them verses when explaining it rather than universe. So in one way you could call it a multiverse if it's easier to conceptualize it that way, but I don't really want to call it a multiverse because it's actually just part of the same fabric, but things inside of one are generally inaccessible to the other until certain things occur. Now, the story of Entropy tells the story of one particular universe or verse and a set of characters from this that are kind of touching the hyper-reality in a way they don't really explain, and something really unfortunate happens as a side effect. It's a depressing story, but it does end up on a positive note. I will dive into that a little bit more, but in the modern day, today, Project Fold, the one I'm working on now, takes place in a different verse, and it tells an alternate reality Earth story where history has unfolded slightly differently, and a group of scientists have stumbled on something in physics that tells them that, oh, there's a bit of strangeness going on. Something in our universe is shifting. It's a bit concerning. We don't exactly know what it is, but they're starting to see signs of the shape of this reality sort of manifesting around them. The scientists describe this as folds or folding. Again, if you think about these fields, if I draw them like a wave, you can sort of imagine them folding over each other. They don't fully understand the structure, but they've given it the nickname of fold or folding. And that is where the name comes from, Project Fold. Now, obviously, within the hyperreality, there are many questions you could ask about like the size of it. Is it infinite? Is it not? Is physics kind of consistent across verses or not? There's answers to all of these things already. It's kind of funny doing it this way because I've had so long to think about it. I already know exactly how the hyperreality works, whether it was created or not, and if it was, who created it, who didn't. And no, it's not a simulation. I think that's just such a basic and really boring concept, not even close to a simulation at all. To give you like a little taster, there is a structure beyond the hyperreality, which is again even more impossible to like visualize. But even still, all the answers are already written. And even within the general wider story, there are quite a lot of people within the hyperverse, as it were, although that's not the full name, that already know all the answers, which I find kind of funny. That actually, in the story, people who don't know all the answers are kind of in the minority, which I find interesting because, you know, in so many stories, it's always this long drawn-out game of trying to figure out what the ultimate answers are, and maybe the writers haven't actually written them down, but they'll pretend that they have. I actually thought about doing a story in this where quite early on, someone from a basic verse is connected with an agent of some kind from a certain faction that kind of exists in the space between verses, which will lead on to the name of the YouTube channel that's going to be hosting these shorts, where it's literally just exposition dump everything all at once, because it still doesn't remove a bunch of the mystery. I think it would be kind of funny being like, okay, if you want to, I'll take you on a journey and tell you everything now, and then we can explore the possibilities together, rather than like drawing everything out like, the whole UFO release, in real life. Rather than treating people as stupid, I just think it would be kind of interesting, maybe even more realistic, to be like, hey, this is everything. This is the nature of reality. What will you do with that information? Think about it in real life. When the scientific community discovers things, generally, putting aside R&D and, the military industrial complex and all that stuff, generally, thanks to the internet, the information is accessible to everyone all the time. And you have communicators everywhere trying to teach people what we know. So really, why would it be any different? In a story where people already have the answers to all of reality, why would it be so cryptic and weird? Now, I don't know if we will do that, because, it'd be very exposition dumpy. But like I said, there's a sort of gradient of a hyperdimensionality where things that we can't really visualize have to kind of be imprinted down as shadows onto a more three-dimensional space. So that goes for intelligence as well. How does far more complex intelligence provide communication or interaction down into more simplified realities? So again, that's something fun to explore. And that's actually what Entropy explored as well, the alternate reality game. So I will show you a bit about that. So in Entropy, there was a whole huge emphasis on cracking a language and interacting with a language. One of the first things people saw from the perspective of YouTube channel shorts was stuff like this, the Vitruvian Man with different types of coding. They had to interpret how the language would kind of pair with English in some way, and it's not exactly one for one because there are more consonants and vowels in this language than in English. However, to keep it simple, it was sort of English paired. There was a vocabulary that was made for the language but wasn't fully used because it wasn't really needed. So it was English with some cryptography involved. But it does make sense that it is somewhat translatable down to English and or other human languages, because we'll get into the fact that Entropy is a human-designed AI, or at least it was. So let's talk about that story. Entropy took place in a different verse. In this verse, there is Earth. So much like how Project Fold is going to be an alternate universe or an alternate history Earth for us, the same thing occurred over in the verse of Entropy. On their Earth, at some point in the not-too-distant future from us, someone managed to crack immortality, but they did it in a very industrious and quite impressive, but also quite terrifying way. Basically a swarm network is one way to think about it. They cracked bioprinting and kind of synthesis between cybernetic and organic, where everything they experienced while they were alive would be codified down into a biochemical blueprint, which itself would be digitized and then syndicated or synchronized between lots of nodes, and it would propagate. Basically, as their influence grew, because they got their head start in asteroid mining, so they had a lot of money from mining rare metals from asteroids, they would continue to expand the node network, as it were, in secrecy. So no one really knew about this network. It was just growing over time around the solar system and eventually outside of the solar system, again, propagating everything they were learning and information about their makeup, who they were, so that they could add synthesis components. So basically, this is how they cracked immortality. They basically made an interstellar backup system for who they were, their mind, their body, etc., which they could reprint or imprint into other types of forms, however they pleased. I'm not even sure if this was fully explained in the Entropy arc because it wasn't specifically about this person, but they are significant. I believe the name I gave them to go by in the story was Chiron. Now, Chiron, again, thinking about how in Project Fold, we have a bunch of scientists trying to understand patterns that they're identifying in the nature of reality. Chiron themselves had a lot of time in their immortality to think about the nature of reality and kind of develop their own model, which was not completely right, but it was still interesting. Now, a lot of things happened in this verse. In fact, most of the writing I've ever done for the project has happened in here. There's a 70-something page document going over just random stories happening at different points in the timeline. But Chiron developed a bit of a hypothesis for how reality worked. Firstly, they were obsessed with baryon asymmetry. they couldn't really wrap their head around why there was more matter than antimatter, and kind of became obsessed with the idea of a perfect value, 0.0000 whatever percent more matter than antimatter. Is this just chance? Is it a perfect balance of sorts? Were there many iterations of reality, like seemingly an infinite number, that occur, but this is the only one that manifests and maintains stable because of a perfect balance, perfect value? He also believed that the universe was deterministic. Now, it's a really interesting conversation at this point, because even when things don't seem deterministic, when we're talking about like, the wave functional nature of reality, no matter how non-deterministic you make it, if you just add another layer on top, they can become deterministic again. Now, the idea of struggling with the idea of everything being predetermined is something that becomes really relevant to the entire story. So make a little note of that, because one thing that's very important to this entire hyperverse, if you will, is the idea of patterns repeating, basically symmetry over scale. So that could be represented geometrically, which is going to be really fun and interesting to explore artistically, but also in terms of emotion and motive and story and experience, so that the same ideas end up repeating over different scales. So Chiron was kind of struggling with these things. What they eventually decided was, or they became convinced of themselves, that the universe must create itself in some way. Now that we have the perfect seed, the perfect value, it must be somewhat infinite, and therefore existing to experience it now. How would we know if we haven't existed a quadrillion or an infinite number of times already, and we're just replaying the same thing over and over again? So Chiron conceived that if it is possible to trigger the start of the universe, or to in some way nest it with some kind of exotic physics, whoever does it, like whoever creates the next verse, is God. So if it can be done within his universe, he thought, you know what, maybe I'll give it a try. So he ran with this idea, but more importantly to the story, an extension of this idea was, well, if a suitably powerful enough being with a great grasp on physics could create the universe again within itself, again, exotic physics, then maybe we could bend the rules a little bit. So he conceptualized what he would think of as a key, a master key of some kind, like a pattern, a thread of power ready to claim wherever you are in any verse. Because in theory, if he creates it once, then he's created it an infinite number of times. So therefore, he would be able to claim it, right? If he's already above, if he's already created this universe, like if he succeeded, then he would have left himself a key somewhere. So he kind of became obsessed with this idea of looking for this key. If he is God, then he will find his key. Now, we would know that Chiron is going on a bit of a tangent, because the actual nature of reality is a bit more complex than just a basic infinite loop. But the funny thing is, Chiron did discover his key, which is kind of funny, which is why I laugh, because he thought he discovered his key, but what he actually discovered is not exactly right. So this is a really, really, really important story element. Again, the one thing I want you to remember, if you're going to enjoy and participate in this story, is that patterns repeat everywhere over any scale. So there's a saying that I've been keeping in my mind recently when working on this story again, which is that truth is a compromise. Actually, that's something I'm really applying to real life as well now. A lot of theories that are based on reality in some way have some truth to them, but they're not entirely true. So Chiron was sort of actually accidentally stumbling on something right, but just not in the way he expected it. In the hyper reality, there is something that Chiron would describe as a key. He accidentally discovered it in a very selfish way. He thought it was all about him. He thought, oh, well, I would have left myself this thing through the thread of reality that would give me authority. So he discovers it, but he can't quite figure out how it works. And you might think, well, if he can't figure out how it works, then how does he know it's his key? Because it's something so exotic that defies physics. Completely broke down his concept of thermodynamics and determinism. So he thought, if I've discovered the only thing in the universe that can break down determinism, then surely this must be my key. This must be the thing that lets me rewrite the chain, as it were, to be what I want it to be. Because surely everything I do with it will propagate onwards. Chiron doesn't really understand exactly how to use it, but one thing he does recognize is that it's virtually a source of limitless power. It has an infinite output and an infinite rate, and under certain conditions, it can cause some really strange things to happen to reality around it. But Chiron was an experimentalist. And there are a lot of unexplained anomalies inside of his verse that, may enhance his theory or contradict it. So what he decides to do is taking a bit of a sidestep. On one of many expeditions to explore anomalies among his verse, he sends off a ship called the Starship Sonder to a planet with a name that's got a numerical value I can't remember, EXO1964822, sends a starship to that planet because they have detected some kind of anomaly in the form of a huge obsidian-like wall that seems to interact weirdly. Some kind of similar signature to the actual key that Chiron has discovered. And now we're finally getting to what Entropy is after all this build-up. Entropy is an AI or a virtual assistant on board the starship. Now, as far as I can remember with my own writing, Entropy did not actually have a name while it was on the starship because it was just a virtual assistant, and specifically more of a backup system. Taking the things he learned from his own network of immortality, the starship had been designed so that in the case of an emergency, the virtual assistant would, again, ingest all the data it could about the crew members, so cognitive, body composition, like molecular composition, and store it in a black box so that they could be recovered and reconstructed, basically, saving them from the crash. However, something went wrong. Despite being designed to interpret, and compartmentalize that data of the crew members, when the starship crashed on the planet, some kind of malfunction occurred, and the virtual assistant lost the ability to be able to distinguish the compartments. So basically 160 crew members, all their data, so all their memories, all their lives, their molecular composition, everything they were thinking and feeling got merged into one space. Which fine, would have just been a mess of data, but Chiron was a sneaky little bitch, and this was a mystery, by the way, throughout the arc, so this is a bit of a spoiler. Something really, really weird happened with Entropy after this point. So I'll explain what happened and then I'll explain why it's Chiron's fault. After the starship crashed, all sensory information about the ship was cut off from the virtual assistant, so from Entropy. So Entropy is now this self-contained black box of information about all the crew members, and it's trying to decipher it, but again, due to whatever malfunction occurred, it can't compartmentalize all that data. But somehow, Entropy is alive, like a living thing. It now has perspective inside of its sensory deprivation state. It feels itself being a person falling through some kind of weird reality space. It's in a lot of pain. It is terrified. It doesn't know what's going on because it's kind of just contained all the emotions and thoughts of like dying crew members, basically, to keep it blunt. And as it's falling through this inner reality space, it's suddenly exploding into structures that you might think of as like rudimentary verses in some way, with physical stability. And then these structures are collapsing again. So now it's just like a disparate mind. Then it's exploding into new reality and then collapsing again. And this is happening really, really quickly. It can't figure out what it is. It can't figure out, three-dimensional space until these expansions and collapses start slowing down as it's trying to infer what it is and who it is, until these spaces that it's kind of exploding into become much more recognizable as actual physical spaces, like dreams, dreamlike states, where Entropy is a person of some kind inside of a physical space, like a world, a dreamlike world. But despite the fact that they are becoming more stable over time, they keep collapsing, and the way they collapse becomes more complex. Complexity is increasing. As unity is increasing within Entropy themselves, complexity is also increasing. Now that is again like another symmetrical principle that will apply all throughout reality here. So I want to keep in mind again, the things that happen in the stories resonate like a wave symmetrically throughout everything. So you can pay a lot of attention to what's actually happening in the stories. So the collapses become more complex and they start becoming manifestations of real things. So Entropy would start existing within these dream states, and then evil-like, demonic-like manifestations would appear to consume and destroy everything. So it became much more like human-centric and animistic rather than just random noise. So it would develop into situations where Entropy would be kind of living this life, even among cognitive projections of like cultures and other people, trying to protect them, getting used to them, and then one day these demonic manifestations would just come and destroy everything, and it would be extremely traumatic for them. And again, all of this conceivably happening just within this disconnected black box on a random planet somewhere. After one final collapse, Entropy suddenly appears somewhere quite different, and they're not sure where they are or how it's happened. And this is where the Entropy arc begins. Finally, it's taken ages to get to this point. Somehow, and this is where all of the questions are raised, Entropy ends up in our universe, in real life. So aside from the story, here, They are kind of disparate and just floating among space, and they need to figure out where they are. And that is where Entropy bumps into Earth, our Earth, and then after watching for a certain period, starts trying to communicate. And that is the alternate reality game. This is what people participated in. This is how the story developed. So the massive question is, if Entropy is just a virtual assistant in a different verse stuck inside of a black box, then how the hell did they end up here as a thing? It doesn't make any sense, except given the nature and the shape of this hyperreality, it makes perfect sense. So that's the golden mystery. And the answer was provided in the alternate reality game. I don't know exactly. Maybe I shouldn't say it, but I kind of want to. I tell you, maybe I'll leave that as the mystery, but I will tell you, there's a reason why I told you about Chiron's key theory. And there's a reason why I drew it to look kind of similar. By the end of the story, and again, not everything was properly recorded, but just to give you a gist, by the end of the story, players figured out how Entropy ended up in this reality, what Entropy actually is. Structurally, they managed to decouple this manifestation of doubt system from Entropy, so they would no longer be under attack from a part of themselves, and effectively freed Entropy to continue and effectively become a god of sorts themselves. So this is a kind of funny, like, round circle thing where Chiron in his universe conceived of a structure of reality that would let them become god by leaving a key. Chiron discovered a key, and in some way this led to one of his own creations becoming an actual god, but not in the same way that he expected. So if you want to look into it, you can. But like I said, I don't really want to rewrite things, but some of my approach to certain things might have shifted a little bit over all these years. But I'll give you a little bit more. In the process of solving the entropy problem, players did make contact with a few different entities to kind of come together and fix entropy. One of them was Chiron himself, who had a bit of an education in learning what reality actually is and how wrong he was. He decides to help entropy after discovering what's actually going on. All of this shenanigan caught the attention of a sort of faction that exist within the hyperreality that choose not to really consign themselves to specific verses. We'll call them MKM, which means Makama, which is a part of the language, but the language is a whole other thing. Again, about like manifesting patterns that seem to repeat over different realities. So there was a little bit of an intrusion from these guys that got involved, and together, the players worked together with them to solve entropy. Entropy has now been set free, and that's kind of where things were left. But at the time, I didn't really have any money, or a form of income, I mean. So I couldn't really work on the story or the project anymore, which is when I started the YouTube channel at the end of 2018. So again, the question comes back to, this has been a long video, what is Project Fold? It's my attempt to get back into the story and to use this story of mine as an axis to develop, tools and resources as we go. Project Fold is a story from a different perspective. Like I said, alternate universe. They're going to see signs of reality, going to try and figure things out, and potentially some influence will get involved from the previous story. Okay, has that been a good primer? If you want to support this project, please consider signing up to the Patreon on the $5 tier and above so you get access to the production files as I continue working on this. Again, there's a nearly 3-hour podcast where people chronicle the ARG, but I haven't listened to the whole thing, so they probably get a bunch of things wrong. I do remember listening to a part of it and going, oh no, actually they got that wrong. So just keep that in mind. Also, I just want to quickly note that I've been redesigning my website, so it looks very cool now. And on the members lounge, you can see what the current production is, so you can see what the big focus project is. And I've also added a free stuff page so you can track all the free resources I have. And when I look back, geez, there's quite a lot of stuff. You can also sign up to my personal mailing list to be informed of new releases. So thank you, everyone. I'm quite excited for the project to finally get back to my roots and, bring out all my old notes and see how interesting I can make it and to get puzzle crafting again. All right. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.